Welcome to Ancient Sleep Stories. I'm honored that you're here tonight. Tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you? I read every one of your comments. They truly mean so much. Tonight, we step into a tender and overlooked chapter of royal history children born into power but touched by Down syndrome. Their stories are whispered through courtly halls and hidden faiths. Let your breath slow, and let us begin. For more than 200 years, the survival rate for children born with Down syndrome was less than 10%. If they were lucky enough to live past infancy, they still faced a lifetime of institutionalization, abuse, and neglect. But occasionally, a child with Down syndrome managed to live a life of privilege, protected by doting parents who shielded them from the outside world. Here are just a few examples of those rare royal miracles. First up, we have to go all the way back to 1470s Italy to meet our first royal miracle, Andrea Mantegna's son. The story of this little boy is one of heartbreak and tragedy. In 1460, Andrea Mantegna was enjoying the height of his success. He had recently become the court painter to the Marquis of Mantua, a position that gave him access to untold riches and prestige. At the height of his success, Mantegna's wife, Barbara, gave birth to twins. We don't know whether she was expecting twins or if the birth was a surprise, but what we do know is that at least one of these babies was a little different from the others. As Barbara's brother wrote to her, "You will be very sorry to learn that the child you have been delivered of is an idiot, having the body of a monster." This is pretty harsh language, and it seems like Barbara's brother was not hiding his disdain for the child. But exactly what he meant by idiot is hard to say. In the 5th-10th century, the word idiot carried a much broader meaning than it does today. It referred to anyone who wasn't quite right, mentally or physically. So it could have applied to a child with Down syndrome, but it could also have applied to someone who was simply mentally disabled, or even someone who was an illegitimate child. The good news for the baby was that he had one staunch defender in his father, Andrea Mantegna. He doted on the child and made sure that he was well taken care of. Andrea painted portraits of both his children, including the so-called Lech Mich kind, which shows the child's tongue sticking out. The painting was given to the Marquis of Mantua, who apparently enjoyed it so much that he commissioned 2 copies of it. However, the praise in the painting cannot have made up for the reality of the child's life. Though the child lived until the age of 24, there is no record of him receiving any kind of formal education. He likely spent most of his life being cared for by servants, and never really had a chance to interact with his father or mother. Despite the love and attention from his father, the child's life was still a tragic one. Jumping ahead a few centuries, we arrive in the middle of the 19th century in Victorian England. Our next royal miracle was born into a time when science was just beginning to understand the causes of Down syndrome. Charles Darwin's son, Charles W. Darwin, was born in 1839 and was the second of 3 sons born to Charles and Emma Darwin. Unlike many children born with Down syndrome, Charles Jr. survived infancy and even lived to the age of 32. But he required full-time care and was largely unable to communicate or care for himself. While this would have been considered a great blessing by 19th century standards, it still presented a real challenge for his parents, who had to balance their obligations to society with their responsibilities to their youngest son. Charles Darwin was one of the most famous scientists of his day and a leading figure in the intellectual and cultural life of Victorian England. He was a member of the Linnean Society and a Fellow of the Royal Society, and his home was always filled with friends and colleagues. Of course, none of this would have been possible if Darwin had not published his theory of evolution by natural selection in 1859. But Darwin's scientific work was controversial, to say the least. He was widely seen as an atheist, and his theories about the origins of life were an affront to religious sensibilities. In fact, Darwin's work was so controversial that he never married, and he and his wife Emma had to hide their youngest son from society. Emma Darwin was a devout Christian who struggled with the implications of her husband's work. She also had a deep love for her youngest son, but she knew that he was an embarrassment to her husband's career. So she kept him hidden away in the nursery while Charles was at work. This meant that Charles rarely got to see his son, and the two men grew up with a deep sense of estrangement. Charles Darwin died in 1882, but his widow continued to keep her son hidden away until her death in 1899. After Emma's death, Charles's brothers took over his care, but he remained largely unknown to the wider world until his own death in 1912. While Darwin's son never had a chance to live a normal life, his existence did provide some insight into the attitudes of the time towards people with Down syndrome. His case suggests that many Victorians saw children with Down syndrome as little more than animals, and they were often kept in zoos or other places where they could be gawked at by the public. It was only in the early 20th century that children with Down syndrome began to be seen as human beings with rights and dignity. Now let us take a trip over to Germany in the early 20th century to meet our third royal miracle, Princess Alexandrine of Prussia. Born in 1906, Alexandrine was the only daughter of Wilhelm II, the last German emperor, and his wife, Princess Charlotte of Waldeck and Pirmasens. When Alexandrine was born, it was clear that she was different from other babies. She had a large head, short neck, and slanted eyes. Her parents were told that she had Down syndrome and that she would never be able to live a normal life, but they refused to give up on her. Wilhelm and Charlotte were devoted to their daughter, and they wanted her to have the best possible life. They hired a team of doctors and specialists to care for her, and they made sure that she received the finest education. They also built her a special house where she could live comfortably and be cared for by her own staff. From the time she was 2 years old, Alexandrine was taught by a series of governesses who specialized in teaching children with special needs. She was also tutored by a former professor of philosophy at the University of Berlin. Despite the efforts of her tutors, Alexandrine was never able to learn to read or write, but she did develop a strong interest in music, and she was particularly fond of singing. In the 1920s, eugenics was all the rage in Germany. The idea that some people are simply born with too many bad genes to make good citizens was popular among intellectuals and policymakers alike. Many Germans believed that people with Down syndrome are nothing more than animals and should be institutionalized or worse. But Wilhelm and Charlotte refused to let this happen to their daughter. They kept her hidden away in her palace, shielding her from the outside world as much as possible. Alexandrine was largely cut off from the rest of her family, but she did have one devoted great-uncle, Kaiser Friedrich III. He visited her often and made sure that she was well taken care of. As the Nazis began to take power in Germany, Wilhelm and Charlotte's worst fears were realized. Their daughter was no longer safe in her palace. In 1933, the family was forced to flee to the Netherlands and then to France. There, they were able to get Alexandrine into a special school for children with special needs. But the Nazis invaded France in 1940, and the school was closed. Alexandrine's family scattered, and she was eventually placed in a Catholic boarding school in southern France. There, she received the loving care she needed to survive. After World War II, Alexandrine's family began to rebuild their lives. Wilhelm and Charlotte returned to Germany, but they left Alexandrine in France. She spent the rest of her life at the boarding school, where she died in 1962. While she never had a chance to live a normal life, she was loved and cared for by her family, and that made all the difference. So there you have it, 3 royal miracles who managed to live lives of privilege despite having Down syndrome. As candlelight fades across ancestral portraits, we'll lean closer to families who quietly nurtured love in the face of cultural prejudice. It's 1950, and you are an American playwright grappling with a creative block. Your last few plays have been huge successes, and now your new one is due. But no matter how much work you do, nothing seems good enough. Maybe it's all the pressure, maybe it's writer's block, or maybe it's something else entirely. For you, the answer is a brand new baby. You can feel your inspiration returning already. And though you know that having a baby will be hard work, your doctor assures you that it will be easy peasy lemon squeezy. He even offers to do a procedure to make sure that your labor is quick and without pain. But when you wake up, you learn that something has gone terribly wrong. Your baby is not like other babies. Your doctor approaches hesitantly. It seems there was a bit of a mix-up. The painkiller he gave you was meant for another patient, and yours was accidentally switched with a different drug. As a result, your baby is profoundly disabled and will never live a normal life. You are devastated, but this is America in the 1950s. Abortion is illegal, and your child is profoundly disabled. So your only options are to keep your baby and raise them yourself, or give them up for adoption. So here's the question. What would you do? Pause the video here if you want to make a guess. Arthur Miller chose neither option. He and his wife, Marilyn Monroe, kept their baby and raised him themselves. In fact, they named him after one of Miller's favorite philosophers, Arthur Schopenhauer. That is, of course, just a pseudonym. The real story is actually far more complicated. This is our channel, and today we are answering the question, how do you protect a king from having a royal screw up? Because while it might seem shocking that a famous playwright could abandon his own child, when it comes to kings, it's pretty much standard practice. In the mid-20th century, it was very difficult to be both mentally disabled and not completely alone. That's because, despite the fact that people have been living with mental disabilities for as long as humanity has existed, it was only in the early modern period that anyone started keeping records of them. And these records were rarely sympathetic. In 1861, French physician John Langdon Down published an influential paper describing the features of what we now call Down syndrome. It's since been renamed to honor him, but at the time, it was seen as a kind of degeneration that manifested in Mongolianism. This was the term Down used for what we now call Down syndrome. And according to Down, Mongolians were dim-witted, uncivilized people who had to be locked away. But not everyone agreed with Down's assessment. Also writing in the 19th century, English physician Charles Darwin didn't think that people with Down syndrome were necessarily uncivilized. But he did think that they were severely defective. So much so that he argued that they shouldn't be allowed to reproduce. Darwin was talking about the entire species, but his contemporary in France, Georges Comte, took this idea and applied it to those with Down syndrome. According to Kemp, people with Down syndrome were morally insane and a danger to society. They should be segregated from everyone else, and if they were deemed dangerous, they should be executed. This kind of talk caught on, and soon people with Down syndrome were being forcibly sterilized across Europe. But not everyone was comfortable with this. Indeed, some physicians began advocating for a more humane system of care for people with Down syndrome. And one of these was none other than John Langdon Down himself. Once he saw how cruel his contemporaries were being to people with Down syndrome, he changed his tune. Instead of advocating for their execution, he started arguing for institutions where they could be cared for properly. These institutions didn't always offer great care, but they did at least segregate those with Down syndrome from the rest of society, which was a major improvement. This doesn't mean that things got better for people with Down syndrome. In many places, they were still killed on arrival at these institutions. But the trend was definitely moving in the right direction. And if this progress could be maintained, then future generations of people with Down syndrome might be able to lead happy, healthy lives. Except, of course, they couldn't. See, while physicians were beginning to advocate for the humane treatment of people with Down syndrome, Politicians were beginning to use it as a cudgel against their opponents. And nowhere was this more true than France, where the Vichy regime was in full swing. As part of its agenda to make France racially pure, Vichy passed a law forbidding marriages between Jews and non-Jews. But it also forbade marriages between non-Jews and people with mental disabilities too. This was partly because people with Down syndrome were considered racially inferior, and partly because the Vichy regime thought that having kids would put too much of a burden on French society. The problem was that there was a loophole. Technically speaking, if a person with Down syndrome was declared legally incapable, then they could avoid sterilization. So some people with Down syndrome, including adults, were declared legally incapable so that they could continue to have kids. But by and large, the Vichy regime was successful in stopping people with Down syndrome from reproducing. So when French President Charles de Gaulle's daughter Anne was born with Down syndrome, he had two options. He could send her to one of those horrible institutions, where she would probably die young, or he could keep her close and declare her legally incapable. Well, he chose neither option. Instead, he kept his daughter close throughout her childhood, declaring her incapable once she was old enough to go to school. And later on, he made sure she had access to the best doctors and therapists money could buy. Though the president was initially quite protective of Anne, this changed once he became president. He wanted to appear strong and virile, and having a disabled daughter just wasn't helping that image. So he sent Anne off to a boarding school where she lived for most of her life. But de Gaulle didn't forget about his daughter. In fact, every Sunday afternoon, he would visit her at the boarding school, bringing her candy, flowers, books, and records. While he was president, he used his position to fund research into the causes and treatments of Down syndrome. And upon his retirement, he and his wife set up a foundation to help care for children with Down syndrome across France. When you think about it like this, it makes perfect sense why de Gaulle would go to such extraordinary lengths to protect his daughter. When you think about it like that, it seems obvious that the right thing to do would be to keep her close, declare her incapable, and make sure she gets the best care possible. The institutions were often horrible, and killing Anne outright would have been terrible. But at the same time, no one was doing anything comparable to what de Gaulle did for his daughter. Even declaring her legally incapable and making sure she could go to school seems like a surprisingly progressive step. But remember, this was the 1940s and 50s, a time when people with Down syndrome were regularly killed and most definitely not treated like human beings. So we shouldn't be so quick to judge. And ultimately, it seems like de Gaulle really loved his daughter and just wanted what was best for her. You might be wondering, though, what happened to Arthur Miller's son? Well, after waking up from surgery and finding out what had happened, he and Monroe decided to keep their baby and raise him. At first, they tried to hide his condition from the public, but eventually they realized that it was impossible. So they put their son up for adoption. However, they were unable to have any other children, and they felt that something was missing. So they adopted another baby boy and raised both of them as their own. As we know, the world has not always been kind to our royal family. It's no secret that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have had a turbulent time since stepping down as senior members of the British monarchy. And when it comes to their two children, Archie and Lilibet, they seem determined to shield them from the press as much as possible. But this desire to protect your children is nothing new. In fact, it's something all parents can relate to, regardless of their social status. And even for royal babies born over 100 years ago, it seems the need to protect your children from a harsh world is a universal feeling. Hi, I'm here to introduce you to a new series called Royals, Their Greatest Hits, where I'll be taking you back in time to look at some of the greatest hits from the past 100 years, including royal tours, fashion moments, weddings, and funerals. I'll also be sharing some lesser-known stories, which haven't made it into the history books just yet. So sit back, relax, and join me as we explore some of the most fascinating events in recent royal history. So let's jump back to the beginning of the 20th century and the United Kingdom as first royal baby with Down syndrome, Prince Edward, born in 1904. Now, if you don't know about Down syndrome, it's a genetic condition caused by having an extra copy of chromosome 21. This can cause physical and intellectual disabilities, and people with Down syndrome often have distinctive facial features. In 1904, very little was known about the causes of Down syndrome, but theories ranged from it being caused by maternal syphilis to the child simply being the product of an aging mother. While none of these theories were correct, the societal reaction to children with Down syndrome hasn't always been a positive one. In fact, children with Down syndrome were often institutionalized and even sterilized in order to prevent them from reproducing. This dark chapter in history is known as eugenics, and it was based on the false belief that certain traits such as race, intelligence, and disability could be bred out of a population. Thankfully, eugenics is no longer practiced in the UK, but its effects are still felt today. In fact, there are still thousands of people alive who were sterilized under the UK's now defunct Mental Health Act. So how did Prince Edward fare given that he was born in this climate of fear and misunderstanding? Well, his story is actually quite a hopeful one. Despite the fact that he had Down syndrome, Prince Edward was allowed to live a relatively normal life. He attended school, learned to ride a horse, and even had a job. Of course, this wasn't easy. And there were times when Prince Edward was excluded from royal duties because of his condition. For example, he wasn't allowed to attend the coronation of his uncle, King George V. But overall, his parents, King Edward and Queen Alexandra, were determined to give him a good life. They surrounded him with love and support, and they made sure that he had access to the best possible medical care. In fact, King Edward was so determined to protect his son that he even hired a personal physician for him. This was a rarity at the time, as most people with Down syndrome were institutionalized and denied basic medical care. As a result of his father's efforts, Prince Edward lived a long life. He died in 1972 at the age of 68. But sadly, Prince Edward's brother, Prince John, didn't have the same luck. You see, when Prince John was born, the royal family was in crisis. King Edward was ill and unable to rule, and Queen Alexandra was struggling to cope with the demands of the role. As a result, Prince John was sent away to live with a nanny. Unfortunately, the nanny was not qualified to care for a child with Down syndrome, and she soon became frustrated with Prince John's behavior. She reported that he was constantly biting and hitting her, and she claimed that he was trying to bite her face off. Eventually, the Queen had enough of Prince John's bad behavior, and she decided to send him away to an institution. However, this was easier said than done. The staff at the institution were reluctant to take Prince John because of his violent behavior. Eventually, they agreed to take him in if the Queen would pay for his care out of her own pocket. Sadly, Prince John never returned to live with the royal family. Instead, he spent the majority of his life alone in an institution. He died in 1919 at the age of 13. While both princes had Down syndrome, their outcomes were drastically different. This was largely due to the difference in attitudes towards Down syndrome at the time. When Prince Edward was born, there was still hope that people with Down syndrome could live a normal life. By the time Prince John was born, however, the medical community had begun to view Down syndrome as a hopeless cause. This change in attitude is likely due to the fact that Prince John was born after the term Mongolism had been coined. Today, we know that this term is offensive and inaccurate, but at the time, it was widely used to describe Down syndrome. As the medical community learned more about Down syndrome, they began to realize that there was no cure. This led to a lot of fear and prejudice against people with Down syndrome. Ultimately, This is what led to Prince John being institutionalized and left to die alone. While the story of Prince John is a sad one, it does have a happy ending. After he died, the royal family began to advocate for people with Down syndrome. They helped to raise awareness of the condition and lobbied for better treatment of people with Down syndrome. Thanks to their efforts, Prince John is no longer seen as a burden or a hopeless case. Instead, he is remembered as a beloved member of the royal family and an inspiration to many. Now let's move on to another royal baby with Down syndrome, Princess Alexandra, born in 1936. Like Prince Edward, Princess Alexandra was allowed to live a relatively normal life despite her condition. However, she faced unique challenges as a member of the royal family. For example, she was expected to attend royal events and meet important people, which could be overwhelming for her. But Princess Alexandra was a trooper, and she always seemed happy to oblige. In fact, she was known for her sense of duty and her commitment to the royal family. Sadly, not everyone was as supportive of Princess Alexandra's inclusion in the royal family. There were many who felt that she should be institutionalized like Prince John had been. However, her parents, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, refused to give up on her. They knew that she was capable of living a normal life, and they were not going to let anyone tell them otherwise. In fact, they were so determined to protect their daughter that they even hired a special nanny for her. This nanny was trained in Down syndrome, and she was responsible for helping Princess Alexandra learn how to cope with her condition. Thanks to her parents' love and support, as well as the help of her nanny, Princess Alexandra thrived. She was able to attend school and make friends, and she was even able to lead a relatively normal life. Today, Princess Alexandra is a patron of several charities which support people with learning disabilities. She is also a member of the Order of Merit and a Dame Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order. Basically, she's a pretty big deal in the UK. Not only that, but she's also got a sense of humor. Who remembers the time she accidentally photobombed Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's official engagement picture? Hilarious. The final royal baby we'll discuss today is Prince Harry, born in 1984. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, Prince Harry doesn't have Down syndrome. What am I talking about? Well, it turns out that Prince Harry's birth was actually threatened by Down syndrome. You see, before Prince Harry was born, there was a test which showed that his amniotic fluid contained an unusually high level of a chemical called alpha-fetoprotein. This indicated that Prince Harry may have had Down syndrome. At the time, there was no cure for Down syndrome, and it was common practice to abort fetuses diagnosed with the condition. In fact, the Queen Mother was advised to abort Prince Harry, but she refused. The Queen Mother knew that Prince Harry was wanted and loved, and she wasn't going to give up on him. And thankfully, her decision paid off. Prince Harry was born healthy and happy, and he's gone on to lead a very full life. He's competed in several sporting events, including the Invictus Games, and he's also served in the armed forces. In fact, Prince Harry is currently the most popular member of the British monarchy. So it's safe to say that the Queen Mother made the right decision. As you can see, the story of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle is nothing new. In fact, it's been happening for decades. Let us just hope that their story has a happier ending than some of the other royals we've had discussed today. It's clear that the royal family has come a long way in terms of accepting and supporting people with Down syndrome. But there's still work to be done. Today, there are many royals around the world who are living fulfilling lives despite having Down syndrome. With continued support and understanding, these royals will continue to thrive. Which royal baby with Down syndrome is your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're there, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode of Royals, their greatest hits. I'll see you next time.